The morning light filtered through my kitchen window like it had done for the past 43 years, casting the same golden patterns across the worn linoleum floor that Harold and I had installed ourselves when we were young and thought we had forever. I stood there at 70, my hands still steady as they measured flour into the mixing bowl, still capable of creating something beautiful from simple ingredients. The measuring cup was the same one my mother had given me as a wedding. Gift blue ceramic with tiny white flowers, chipped now along the rim, but still perfectly functional. Like me, I suppose. Today was different, though. Today I was baking a cake for 12 people, my 3 children, their spouses, my 6 grandchildren, and little Emma, the great-grandchild who had just learned to walk and whose first word, according to the video Sarah posted on Facebook, had been Mama. Not Gigi, which is what I had hoped she might call me. Not Grandmama like my other great-grandchild used to say before he grew too sophisticated for such childish endearments. Just Mama, as if I didn't exist in her tiny universe at all. I had spent weeks planning this birthday celebration, not because I particularly cared about turning 70 birthdays after. Harold's death felt more like markers of time endured rather than life celebrated, but because I missed them. God, how I missed them! The house felt too quiet, too empty, too full of memories that echoed off walls that rarely heard laughter anymore. Every room held ghosts of Christmas mornings and birthday parties and Sunday dinners when the dining room table groaned under the weight of food and love and conversation that lasted until the streetlights came on. I convinced myself that if I made it special enough, if I prepared their favorite foods and decorated just right, if I showed them how much I still had to give, they would remember why they used to love coming here. They would remember that this house had been the center of their world once, that these walls had witnessed their first steps and first words and first heartbreaks. They would remember that I had been more than just their mother. I had been their confidant, their cheerleader, their safe harbor in every storm. The vanilla cake batter swirled in the bowl, smooth and perfect, just like I'd made it for decades of birthdays and celebrations. This recipe was Harold's favorite, passed down from his mother, who had taught me to make it during our first year of marriage when I was still learning to navigate her German perfectionism and gentle criticisms. More vanilla, Maggie, she would say in her accent that never quite faded despite 50 years in America. The vanilla is what makes people remember. I remembered making this same cake for Sarah's 8th birthday, when she insisted on pink frosting and sprinkles shaped like stars because she was convinced she was going to be an astronaut. She had worn her space costume to her own party and refused to take off the helmet until I threatened to put the cake away. I remembered Tommy's 16th, when he was too cool to admit he still loved his grandmother's baking but ate 3 pieces anyway, trying to impress some girl he'd invited who spent the entire party on her phone. I remembered making it for my husband's 50th, just 6 years before the cancer took him and left me in this house with only memories and a cat named Whiskers. For company. Harold had loved birthdays. He was the one who insisted on making them special. Who would sneak out early in the morning to buy flowers and balloons? Who would spend hours wrapping presents with the kind of meticulous attention he brought to everything he loved? Life is short, Maggie, he would say, usually while struggling with a particularly stubborn piece of ribbon. We have to celebrate the good moments while we can. After he died, I had tried to keep up the tradition. I still bought flowers for my own birthday, still made special meals, still wrapped presents for the children and grandchildren, even when they forgot to wrap mine. But it felt hollow without Harold's enthusiasm to buoy it up. Like trying to sing a duet when your partner has left the stage, and you're suddenly aware of how thin your voice sounds all alone. The dining room table gleamed under the chandelier. We'd bought for our 25th anniversary a splurge that Harold had justified by saying we deserved. Something beautiful after a quarter-century of marriage and raising 3 children on a bookkeeper's salary. I had polished that table until I could see my reflection in it. Polished it the way my mother had taught me, with lemon oil and circular motions and the kind of patience that comes from having Nowhere else to be and nothing but time. I had set it with the good China the Spode Christmas pattern that we'd bought piece by piece over the years, adding a place setting here and a serving dish there until we had a complete set that only came out for special occasions. Now, what was the point of saving it anymore? What was I saving it for? 12 place settings, each one arranged with the precision of someone who had nothing but time and hope and muscle memory from decades of hosting family gatherings. Cloth napkins folded into perfect triangles, silverware polished until it caught the light and sang when you tapped it gently with a fingernail. Crystal glasses that Harold had given me for our 10th anniversary and that I'd been terrified to use for years until he convinced me that beautiful things were meant to be enjoyed. Not preserved. The centerpiece was a arrangement of chrysanthemums from the garden Harold and I had planted together. Flowers that bloomed faithfully every fall in shades of rust and gold and deep burgundy. Harold had loved autumn, loved the way the light slanted differently and the air smelled of wood smoke and possibility. October is when the world shows off, he used to say. And I had thought about those words this morning as I cut the stems and arranged them in the crystal vase that had been his mother's. I had made enough food for an army, the way I always did when I was nervous or excited or afraid. Pot roast with carrots and potatoes, the way my mother taught me 60 years ago when I was a newlywed who could barely boil water without burning it. The meat had been expensive, more than I usually spent on groceries for an entire week, but I had wanted everything to be perfect. Green bean casserole with the crispy onions on top that the grandchildren always picked off first, leaving little piles of beans they would eat reluctantly if bribed with promises of cake. Homemade rolls that filled the house with the scent of yeast and butter, the kind of smell that used to draw the children into the kitchen like magnets, eager to sneak pieces of dough when they thought I wasn't looking. And the cake, of course. 3 layers of perfection with buttercream roses that took me 2 hours to pipe just right. My arthritis had made it harder over the years, the small movements more difficult. But I had persevered because I knew Sarah loved roses and Tommy loved chocolate filling and Michael always asked for extra frosting flowers. I had made it with all their preferences in mind, a cake that was really 12 small gestures of love baked into one perfect whole. The house smelled like love. It smelled like family dinners and holidays and all the times when these rooms were filled with voices and warmth and belonging. I had even cleaned the guest rooms, changed the sheets, and put out fresh towels in case anyone wanted to stay over the way. They used to when the children were small and bedtime at Grandma's house was always negotiable. I had stocked the refrigerator with their favorite drinks, Diet Coke for Sarah, beer for the men, apple juice boxes for the grandchildren, and whole milk for little Emma, even though I wasn't sure if she was drinking regular milk yet. I had put on my good dress, the navy blue one with the pearl buttons that my daughter-in-law Michelle once said made my eyes look bright. It was a dress I'd bought for Harold's company Christmas party 3 years before he died, a dress that had hung in my closet unworn since his funeral because where does a 70-year-old widow wear a good dress? I had paired it with the pearl earrings Harold gave me for our 30th anniversary and the bracelet the children had pooled their money to buy me for Mother's Day when Tommy was in high school and still thought jewelry was an appropriate gift. For mothers, I wore lipstick for the first time in months, Sevillon's Cherries in the Snow, a color I'd been wearing since the 1980s because Harold once said it made me look like a movie star. I sprayed a little of the perfume that had been sitting on my dresser, gathering dust since Harold died. White shoulders. It's the same scent I'd worn on our wedding day and every anniversary after. The bottle was nearly empty now, and I hadn't been able to bring myself to buy a new one because who was I trying to smell good for? At 3 o'clock, the time I had told everyone to arrive, I sat in my living room chair, the burgundy recliner that faced the window so I could watch 4 cars pulling into the driveway. It was Harold's chair originally, the one he'd sat in every evening after work to read the paper and listen to the news. After he died, I had moved to it gradually, drawn by the way it still smelled faintly of his aftershave and the comfort of seeing the world from his perspective, whiskers curled up on my lap, purring softly, his orange fur warm against my hands. He was getting old too, moving more slowly than he used to, sleeping more, eating less. Sometimes I worried that he was staying alive just to keep me company. It's the way old married couples do, holding on until they're sure their partner will be. Okay, alone. He was the only one who never let me down, never forgot to show up, never had somewhere more important to be. When Harold was dying, Whiskers had spent those last weeks curled up on the hospital bed we'd rented for the living room. Oh, faithful guardian, who seemed to understand that his job was to provide comfort in the face of the incomprehensible. 3:15 came and went. The house was so quiet I could hear the old grandfather clock in the hallway ticking, the same clock that had marked time through 43 years of marriage, through births and deaths, and ordinary Tuesday afternoons that now seemed precious, in their mundane perfection. Then 3:30. The food was ready, staying warm in the oven, the rolls covered with a damp towel the way my mother had taught me. The flowers were perfect. The table was set. The cake stood ready with its 70 candles waiting to be lit. And I sat in Harold's chair with his cat on my lap, watching the empty driveway and trying not to think about what their absence meant. By 4 o'clock, I began to understand what I had been refusing to accept for months now. The phone hadn't rung with apologies or explanations. No cars had pulled up to the house where I had swept away every last autumn leaf and arranged pots of chrysanthemums in cheerful yellows and oranges along the front porch. No footsteps had echoed on the wooden steps that Harold had painted every spring until arthritis made it too difficult and I had taken over the job. Though I never managed to get the lines quite as straight as his. They weren't coming. The realization settled over me slowly, the way cold water seeps through fabric. Not this sharp shock of sudden understanding, but the gradual, horrible recognition that I had been fooling myself. They had forgotten, or worse, they had remembered and chosen not to come. They had weighed my birthday against whatever else they had planned for a Sunday afternoon in October. And I had lost. I sat there with my cat in my empty house, surrounded by enough food to feed 12 people, and tried to remember the last time I had felt this small. When was the last time someone had made me feel like I mattered? When was the last time someone had chosen my company over other options? When was the last time someone had seen me as more than just an obligation to be managed, or a role to be acknowledged? The cake sat on the counter with 70 candles waiting to be lit, and I couldn't bring myself to light even one. What was the point of making a wish when the only thing you wanted was sitting around a table that would remain empty? What do you wish for when you're 70 years old and invisible to the people you love most in the world? Whiskers and I shared a piece of cake in the kitchen, eating it straight from the cake server while standing at the counter like teenagers sneaking dessert before dinner. I gave him a small bite from my fork, and he purred his approval, the sound vibrating through his thin body and into my hands. At least someone appreciated my efforts. At least someone thought I was worth celebrating. At least someone in this world was happy to be in my company. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of cleaning up and putting away. I wrapped up the pot roast in containers that would feed me for a week, though I knew I'd probably throw most of it away because eating alone makes even your favorite foods taste like cardboard. I covered the cake with a glass dome and tried not to look at the 70 unlit candles wilting slightly in the warm kitchen air. I put away the good china, each piece individually wrapped in tissue paper, and nestled back into the cabinet, where it would wait for the next special occasion. That might never come. The flowers would stay on the table, I decided. Even if no one else would see them, I could look at them and remember that Harold had loved autumn, and that I had loved him, and that love, even when it goes unacknowledged, still counts for something. That evening, as I sat in Harold's chair with my tablet, a gift from Christmas 2 years ago that the children had given me to help me stay connected, though I suspected it was really meant to make them feel better about calling less frequently, opened Instagram. I wasn't much for social media, but it had become my window into the lives of people who used to be my world. Sarah posted pictures of her morning coffee and inspirational quotes about living your best life. Tommy shared memes about work that I didn't understand and photos from hiking trips he never invited me on. My youngest, Michael, rarely posted at all, but when he did, studied every photo like a detective searching for clues about who he had become. Social media felt like watching life through a window. I could see everything happening, but I was forever on the outside looking in, observing but not participating, witnessing but not belonging. I saw birthday parties I wasn't invited to, family gatherings that happened without me, holidays that were celebrated as if I didn't exist. It was a special kind of torture, this constant reminder of how easily I had been erased from the narrative of my own family's life. That's when I saw it. The post was from Sarah, uploaded just 2 hours ago. A picture of 12 people gathered around a restaurant table, laughing and raising glasses in a toast. The lighting was warm and golden, the kind of Instagram perfect ambience that made everything look like a magazine spread. My 3 children, their spouses, all 6 grandchildren. Hey, and little Emma, my great-grandchild, sitting in a high chair with what looked like birthday cake smeared across her chubby cheeks. Everyone was dressed nicely, the way you dress for special occasions. The way I had hoped they would dress for my birthday dinner. The caption read, "Family dinner to celebrate Grandma Margaret's 70th. She couldn't make it, but we're thinking of her. #family, #blessed, #grandma love." I stared at that screen until my eyes burned and the words blurred together. They were celebrating my birthday without me. They had gathered 12 people. Exact number 1 had prepared for. The exact guest list I had hoped for, but they had gathered somewhere else. It's in some restaurant with professional lighting and servers, who brought the food instead of spending hours preparing it with love and hope and desperate longing. They had decided I couldn't make it. Not asked, not invited, not even informed. They had simply decided that 70-year-old Margaret would be fine staying home with her cat while they honored her memory from afar. As if I were already gone. As if I were a cherished ancestor, too. Be remembered rather than a living person to be included. The worst part wasn't the exclusion, though. That cut deep enough. The worst part was the narrative they had created to justify it. In their minds, they were being thoughtful. They were celebrating me. They had probably talked about me, shared fond memories, raised their glasses in my honor. They had performed all the rituals of love and celebration while carefully editing out the inconvenience of my actual presence. The fact that I wasn't there was somehow my choice, my limitation, my failing. They had rewritten the story so smoothly that they probably believed it themselves. Grandma Margaret couldn't make it, too old, too frail. It's too much trouble to include in real celebrations, but we're thinking of her. We love her. We're such good children and grandchildren for remembering her even when she's not here. The hashtag grandma love made my stomach turn. It was the social media equivalent of sending thoughts and prayers, a way of performing sentiment, without actually doing the work of love. Love that doesn't require showing up. Love that doesn't require effort. Love that can be reduced to an emoji and a hashtag. And a photo that proves to the world what good people they were. I scrolled through the comments. Friends and acquaintances congratulating them on being such a loving family. So sweet that you remembered, Grandma. Family is everything. She must be so proud. The irony was suffocating. Here were strangers praising my family for their devotion to me while I sat alone in my kitchen, having spent my birthday waiting for people who never intended to come. I set the tablet down with hands that trembled just slightly and walked upstairs to my bedroom, each step feeling heavier than the last. The dress that had made me feel pretty and hopeful this morning now felt ridiculous. Like a costume I had worn to play a part that no one had bothered to tell me was canceled. I changed into my nightgown, even though it was barely 8 o'clock. Because what was the point of staying dressed when there was no one to see me? In the top drawer of my dresser, beneath Harold's old letters tied with a blue ribbon and the jewelry I never wore anymore, was a manila folder I hadn't opened in years. Inside were documents that Harold had insisted we keep updated, papers he had reviewed with our lawyer just months before his death, when he was still hoping the treatment might work, but practical enough to prepare for the possibility that it wouldn't. Our wills, the deed to the house, financial statements, and something else, something I had forgotten about until this moment. Buried under years of grief and the day-to-day routine of learning to live alone, Harold had been a careful man, a planner, someone who worried about worst-case scenarios and prepared for them, with the methodical thoroughness of a man who had lived through the Depression as a child and never quite trusted that security would last the trust fund. Harold had worked for the same accounting firm for 35 years, saved every penny he could, invested wisely in index funds and blue-chip stocks, and worried constantly about what would happen to me if he died first. The house was paid off, but that wasn't enough for Harold. He had established a trust that would ensure I was comfortable for the rest of my life, that would pay for any medical care I might need, that would allow me to age with dignity and independence. What I had forgotten, what had seemed unimportant at the time because I couldn't imagine a world without Harold in it, was that the trust was designed to become their inheritance upon my death. $800,000. The number jumped off the page like an accusation. Enough to change their lives. Enough to pay off mortgages, send grandchildren to college, start businesses, take dream vacations, by the kind of security that Harold had worked his entire life to provide for 6 years since Harold's death. I had lived modestly off his pension and Social Security, barely touching the trust except for major expenses, because what did I need at my age? I had everything I required in this house with my memories and my cat and my small routines. I had been saving it for them, preserving it like the good china, keeping it safe and untouched for the day when they would need it. But as I sat on the edge of my bed, still wearing my carefully applied lipstick and the pearl earrings I had put on for an audience that never arrived, I realized something that felt like waking up from a long, painful dream. They weren't staying away because they were busy. They weren't forgetting to call because life was hectic. They were managing me. They were maintaining just enough contact to ensure their inheritance while investing as little emotional energy as possible in the woman who had raised them, fed them, loved them unconditionally for decades. I was being managed like a portfolio, monitored just enough to ensure I remained stable and profitable, but not enough to require any real engagement or effort. I was an asset to be preserved, not a person to be loved. The realization hit me like a physical blow. How long had this been going on? How long had I been fooling myself that their scattered phone calls and obligatory visits were signs of love rather than maintenance checks? How long had I been grateful for scraps of attention from people who saw me primarily as a future windfall? Thought about the birthday cards that had stopped coming 3 years ago, replaced by generic text messages that felt copy and pasted. Happy birthday, Mom. Hope you have a great day. Love you. No personal touches, no references to shared memories, no acknowledgement of who I was beyond the biological fact that I had given birth to them. I thought about Christmas mornings when I would drive to their houses with carefully chosen gifts, only to be invited in for an hour before they had somewhere else to be, family obligations fulfilled, duty discharged, inheritance secured for another year. I thought about the graduations and recitals and soccer games that I heard about secondhand, through casual mentions in those brief phone calls that felt more like status updates than conversations. Oh, Jenny made honor roll again. We're so proud. As if I were a distant acquaintance, they were updating out of politeness rather than the grandmother who would have loved to celebrate with them, who would have been their biggest cheerleader if anyone had bothered to invite me. When had I become so easy to discard? When had I become someone who couldn't make it to her own birthday celebration, according to their version of reality? When had I stopped being a person with feelings and needs and desires and become simply a placeholder, a name on a trust fund, a woman who would always be there in the background until she quietly wasn't? The answer came to me slowly, like recognition dawning. It had started after Harold died. when I was no longer half of a couple that needed to be considered, when I became just Margaret instead of Harold Dan Margaret. When I transitioned from being a wife and mother to being just a mother, to being just an old woman whose primary value is what she would leave behind when she died. When I became a burden instead of a participant. When my needs became inconvenient and my presence became optional. When including me required effort rather than simply happening naturally. The way it had when Harold was alive to insist on my importance, to make space for me in conversations, to ensure I wasn't forgotten or overlooked. I had enabled it, I realized with growing horror. Every time I accepted their excuses, every time I rearranged my life around their schedules, every time I smiled and said I understood when they canceled at the last minute, I had taught them that I would always be there, always be accommodating, always be grateful for whatever scraps of attention they were willing to give me. I had trained them to treat me as optional because I had never insisted on being essential. I had been so afraid of being a burden, so terrified of being needy or demanding, that I had made myself disappear. I had become so small and undemanding that they had forgotten I existed at all, except as a future financial benefit. That night, I barely slept. I lay in the bed I had shared with Harold for 40 years, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the $800,000 that was supposed to be their reward for loving me, their inheritance for being good children. But what was the point of leaving money to people who couldn't be bothered to show up for your birthday? What was the point of securing the future of people who had already written you out of their present? The next morning, I made my first decision. I called my lawyer, Martin Chambers, who had handled Harold's affairs and had been encouraging me for years to review my estate planning. Martin was one of the few people who still treated me like a person rather than a relic. He remembered my birthday, asked about my health in ways that suggested he actually cared about the answer, and had been patient with my technological difficulties when I'd struggled to understand the various documents Harold had left behind. His answering service took a message, and he called me back before noon while I was feeding Whiskers his breakfast, and trying to figure out what to do with a refrigerator full of food that would never be eaten. Margaret, his voice was warm, familiar. The voice of someone who had known Harold and respected our marriage and understood that my widowhood was a loss, not just a change in status. It's been too long. What can I do for you? Martin, I need to make some changes to my will and the trust. Can you fit me in this week? There was a pause, the kind of professional silence that suggested he was already reaching for his calendar. Course. Is everything all right? You sound different. It was different. For the first time in 6 years, I felt awake. Angry? Yes, but also clear-headed in a way I hadn't been since Harold died. I'm fine, Martin. Just ready to take control of my own life again. We scheduled an appointment for Thursday morning, and I spent the next 3 days thinking about what I wanted to do. The anger burned hot at first, the way it does when you first realize you've been taken for granted. I wanted to punish them, to show them what it felt like to be discarded and forgotten. I wanted to leave everything to charity just to see their faces when they realized that their careful management of our relationship it cost them everything they thought they were entitled to. But as the days passed and the initial rage settled into something more purposeful, I realized that revenge wasn't what I wanted. What I wanted was to matter. What I wanted was to be seen. What I wanted was to use the resources Harold had left me to create something meaningful. Something that would outlast the hurt and disappointment of being forgotten on my 70th birthday. The changes I made to my will were simple but profound. The trust would no longer automatically transfer to my children upon my death. Instead, it would establish a foundation in Harold's name, dedicated to supporting senior citizens who had been abandoned or forgotten by their families. The foundation would provide companionship services, meal delivery, transportation to medical appointments, emergency financial assistance, and small grants to help elderly people maintain their independence and dignity. Every dollar that would have gone to my children, but instead go to help people like me, people whose families had moved on without them, people whose value had been reduced to what they could provide rather than who they were, people who had been carefully managed rather than genuinely loved. But that wasn't the revenge. That was just housekeeping, a redistribution of resources that would do more good in the world than sitting in my children's bank accounts. The real revenge began when I started living. The revenge began 3 weeks later when I enrolled in watercolor classes at the community center. Something I had always wanted to do but never had time for when I was busy being available for everyone else's needs. Harold had encouraged me to take art classes for years, but there had always been something more pressing: children to raise, meals to cook, a household to manage, and later grandchildren to babysit, and aging parents to care for. Now, for the first time since I was 22 years old, I had no one to take care of but myself. The freedom was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. I discovered I had talent, a way of seeing light and shadow that translated beautifully onto paper. My paintings of the garden Harold and I had cultivated together were good enough that my instructor, patient woman in her 50s named Joan, encouraged me to enter them in the local art fair. "You have a gift, Margaret," she said after I'd completed a particularly successful painting of the maple tree in our backyard, the one Harold had planted when Tommy was born, and that now towered over the fence, dropping leaves like golden coins every autumn. "There's emotion in your brush strokes, real feeling. That's something you can't teach." I joined a book club at the library, where I met women like me, widows who had been rendered invisible by families that had moved on without them. Women who understood the particular loneliness of being forgotten by the people you raised, the unique pain of watching your children build lives that had no room for the woman who had given up pieces of herself to help them become who they were. We read everything from mystery novels to poetry, and our discussions became the highlight of my weeks. These women saw me, really saw me in ways my own family hadn't in years. They remembered my opinions from week to week, asked follow-up questions about things I'd said, treated my thoughts and insights as valuable rather than simply polite noise, to be acknowledged and forgotten. Margaret from the book club, we called her Book Club Margaret to distinguish her from me, had been a high school English teacher for 30 years before her husband died, and her children decided she was too old to live alone safely. They had moved her into a senior living facility without consulting her, sold her house without asking what she wanted to keep, and now visited twice a year out of duty rather than love. "The hardest part," she told me one afternoon as we discussed a novel about families and forgiveness, "isn't that they don't love me. It's that they love the idea of me more than they love the real me. They love the mother who never complained, who always said yes, who made their lives easier. They don't love the woman who has opinions and needs and feelings that might be inconvenient." Dorothy, who had been married to the same man for 58 years before a stroke took him, nodded in recognition. Her children lived across the country and called every few months with updates about grandchildren she barely knew. "I raised 4 children," she said, "and I'm not sure any of them actually know who I am. I know who I was to them, but they don't know who I am to myself." These conversations were revelations. I had thought my experience was unique, that I was the only mother who had somehow failed to maintain meaningful connections with her adult children. But it turned out there was an entire population of women like me, women who had given everything to their families and been discarded when their usefulness ended. Women who were loved in theory but ignored in practice. Women who had been reduced to roles rather than recognized as complex human beings. I started volunteering at the hospital, reading to patients who had no visitors. Many of them were elderly, forgotten by families who found excuses not to come. I understood their pain in ways that made me valuable as a companion. My presence mattered to them. My stories, my gentle voice, my willingness to hold their hands when they were scared. These things had meaning and purpose in ways that my carefully prepared birthday dinners and thoughtful gifts apparently did. Not. There was something profound about being needed by strangers when you had been deemed unnecessary by your own family. These patients lit up when I walked into their rooms, grateful for company and conversation and the simple acknowledgement that they still mattered. They asked about my day, remembered details about my life from visit to visit, treated me like a friend rather than an obligation. I adopted a second cat from the animal shelter. A sleek black female named Luna, who complemented Whiskers perfectly. Having two cats made the house feel less empty, and their companionship filled some of the loneliness that had been my constant companion since Harold died. They were getting older, both of them, but they had chosen to spend their remaining years with me, and that choice felt like a gift, even if it came from animals who had limited options. For the first time in years, I felt useful. I felt seen. I felt alive in ways that had nothing to do with my children's approval or attention. I was building a life that belonged to me, filled with people who had earned the right to my time and energy through their genuine interest in my well-being rather than their biological connection to my bank account. The children noticed the changes. Gradually, the way you notice seasons changing, not all at once, but through accumulating evidence that something fundamental had shifted. At first, it was small things. When Tommy called on a Tuesday evening in November, one of his rare, dutiful check-ins that usually lasted about 5 minutes and covered the weather. His work and whether I was doing okay. I couldn't talk long because I was heading out to book club. Book club. He had said as if I'd announced I was joining a motorcycle gang. Since when do you go to book club? Since I decided I wanted to discuss books with other people who actually read them. I replied, and something in my tone must have surprised him because there was a long pause before he said goodbye. When Sarah texted about possibly visiting for Christmas, maybe invitation that would have had me planning for weeks. Just a few months earlier, I told her I'd already made plans to volunteer at the community dinner for people who had nowhere else to go. But Mom, she had called to say, her voice carrying that particular note of frustrated entitlement that adult children use when their parents stop being entirely predictable. We thought you'd want to spend Christmas with family. I am spending it with family, I replied gently. It's not the one I was born into. The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When she spoke again, her voice was different, smaller, somehow, and uncertain in a way I wasn't used to hearing from my confident, successful daughter. We could change our plans if you really want us to come over. If I really wanted them to come over, as if their presence in my life was dependent on my proving how much I needed them. As if love was something I had to earn through demonstrations of desperation rather than something that flowed naturally between people who cared about each other. That's sweet of you to offer, I said, surprised by how calm my own voice sounded. But I'm committed to my volunteer work. Perhaps we can get together in the new year. I heard something in my own voice that hadn't been there before. Confidence. Independence. The sound of a woman who had options. Who had a life that didn't revolve around waiting for other people to remember she existed. It was the voice of someone who mattered to herself, which was perhaps the most revolutionary thing of all. By February, they were paying attention in ways that felt both gratifying and pathetic. Michael, my youngest, showed up at my door on a Saturday morning without calling first, something he had never done in the 6 years since his father died. He found me in my painting smock, working on a watercolor of the sunrise over my back garden. Luna and Whiskers supervising from there, perched on the windowsill where the morning light made their fur glow like they were posing for their own portrait. Mom, he said, looking around the house that was cleaner and more organized than it had been in years, filled with my artwork and photographs from my volunteer activities and books from the library. That suggested a life being actively lived, rather than passively endured. You seem different. Different how? I asked, not stopping my work. The painting was at a delicate stage, and the light was perfect. And for the first time in my adult life, I was prioritizing my own creative process over someone else's need for immediate attention. He shifted uncomfortably, the way children do when they realize their parent has become a person rather than just a role. I don't know, busier, I guess, harder to reach. Sarah said you couldn't talk long when she called last week because you were going somewhere. I was going to my watercolor class, I said, adding a delicate wash of yellow to capture the way morning light filtered through the maple leaves. I've been taking classes for several months now. This is my latest piece. He looked at the painting with surprise, as if he'd never considered that I might be capable of creating something beautiful. It's really good, Mom. I didn't know you could paint. Neither did I replied, finally setting down my brush and turning to give him my full attention. There are a lot of things about me that might surprise you, Michael. I'm discovering them myself. We talked for almost 2 hours that morning. Really talked. In a way we hadn't since he was a teenager, seeking my advice about girls in college. Applications. He's told me about problems at work, about his marriage to Jennifer. T about his fears about raising his own children in a world that felt increasingly uncertain. And I listened, not as a mother desperate to maintain connection at any cost, but as a woman who had learned to value her own time and energy, who offered advice only when asked and support only when it was genuinely wanted rather than desperately needed. When he left, he hugged me longer than usual and said something that stayed with me for days afterward. I like seeing you like this, Mom. You seem yourself again. I didn't realize how much I'd missed that. The revelation that followed his words was startling. I had missed myself too. I had been so busy trying to be what everyone else needed. The perfect mother, the uncomplaining widow, the grateful grandmother, that I had lost track of who I actually was beneath all those roles. I had been performing Margaret instead of being her Dot. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came a phone call that changed everything. It was Sarah, and for the first time in years, she sounded nervous rather than dutiful. Mom, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. I was in my garden planting the tomatoes that Harold and I had grown together for decades. My hands were dirty, my knees ached from kneeling in the soil, and I had never felt more grounded in my own life. What is it, sweetheart? Are you okay? I mean, really? Okay? You seem so different lately, and we're worried that maybe you're, I don't know, having some kind of breakdown or crisis or something. The irony was breathtaking. For 6 years, I had been having a breakdown, a slow-motion collapse of identity and purpose and self-worth, and they hadn't noticed. Now that I was finally building myself back up, they were concerned about my mental health. I'm better than I've been in years, I said, sitting back on my heels and looking up at the sky that was the particular blue of April afternoons. The color Harold always said made him believe in possibilities. Why would you think otherwise? Well, you're always busy when we call. You have all these activities and commitments. You seem less ... available. And Tommy said you've been talking about changing your will. Ah, there it was. The real concern wasn't about my well-being, it was about their inheritance. Tommy must have been discussing my affairs with his siblings, trying to figure out why their reliable, predictable mother had suddenly become someone with her own agenda. I am less available, I said calmly, pulling a weed from between the tomato plants. I have a life now, Sarah. I have interests and commitments and people who depend on me. As for my will, yes, I've made some changes. Harold's money is going to do good in the world instead of just sitting in bank accounts. The silence on the other end of the line was so complete I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and shocked. What kind of changes? The kind that matter to me? I said, standing up and brushing the dirt from my knees. The trust is going to establish a foundation that helps elderly people who've been forgotten by their families. People like me, before I remembered how to matter to myself. Mom, you can't be serious. That money was supposed to be for us, for the grandchildren. Dad worked his whole life to leave us something. Your father worked his whole life to take care of me, I corrected gently. He wanted to make sure I would be secure and comfortable and able to live with dignity. He's doing exactly what he intended. He's taking care of me by giving me the power to create meaning in my life." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Sarah cycling through anger, bargaining, and finally a kind of desperate pleading that would have broken my heart 6 months earlier. Now it simply made me sad that she saw me primarily as a source of future wealth. Sad that she couldn't understand why I might want to use Harold's legacy to help others. Sad that our relationship had become so transactional that she couldn't imagine I might have reasons for my choices beyond spite or senility. After she hung up abruptly, without saying goodbye, sat in Harold's chair with whiskers on my lap, and thought about the woman I had been on my 70th birthday, sitting in this same chair, waiting for people who never intended to come. That woman felt like a stranger to me now, someone I remembered with pity rather than recognition. The foundation was established 6 months later, with Martin's help and the enthusiastic support of several social workers who understood exactly the population we were trying to serve. We called it the Harold Peterson Foundation for Senior Dignity. And our first grant went to a meal delivery service that not only brought food to homebound elderly people, but trained the volunteers to spend time with them, to see them as people, worthy of conversation rather than just recipients of charity. The second grant funded a transportation service that helped seniors get to medical appointments, grocery stores, and social activities. The third established a visiting program that matched isolated elderly people with volunteers who came not to provide services but simply to be present, to listen, to acknowledge that these forgotten people still had stories worth hearing and insights worth sharing. Every dollar that would have gone to my children's bank accounts was instead creating connections, providing dignity, acknowledging the fundamental human need to matter to someone, somewhere, somehow. It was Harold's money doing Harold's work, taking care of people who needed care, just on a scale larger than the two of us. My children's response to the foundation was exactly what I had expected. Tommy called it a slap in the face and accused me of trying to punish them for some imagined slight. Sarah alternated between fury and attempts at manipulation, suggesting that I was being influenced by outsiders who didn't have my best interests at heart. Michael, to his credit, simply went quiet for a few months, processing the reality that his inheritance had evaporated in service of people he'd never meet. The extended family took sides. Harold's sister Dorothy, the one who had taught me to make his favorite cake all those years ago, called to tell me she was proud of me for honoring Harold's values rather than just his bank account. My own sister Patricia, always the practical one, thought I was making a mistake that I'd regret when I needed the money for my own care. But the people who mattered most, the volunteers at the hospital, my watercolor classmates, the women in my book club, the social workers who helped distribute the foundation grants, understood perfectly. They had seen too many elderly people abandoned by families who claimed to love them but couldn't be bothered to show up. They knew that money without presence is just delayed guilt, and that true love requires effort, not just eventual inheritance. A year after my forgotten 70th birthday, I had my ate first. I didn't plan a party or prepare elaborate meals, or wait for phone calls that might not come. Instead, I spent the morning painting in my garden, the afternoon reading to patients at the hospital, and the evening at a small celebration organized by my book club friends. We gathered at Margaret's apartment at the senior living facility because any of us needed to be there, but because it was centrally located and she enjoyed hosting. 7 women who had found each other after being lost by families who had moved on without them. 7 women who had learned to matter to each other in ways that were deeper and more sustaining than biological obligation. Dorothy brought a cake. She had made herself a simple vanilla layer cake that reminded me of all the birthday cakes I had made for other people over the decades. Margaret contributed homemade bread and the good china she had decided to use for everyday occasions rather than saving it for special events that might never come. Joan from art class brought wine and stories about her latest painting adventures. We lit 71 candles and sang happy birthday with the enthusiasm of people who genuinely wanted to celebrate rather than the obligation of people checking off a family duty? When I made my wish and blew out the candles, I wished for more. Years just like this, years of mattering to people who had chosen to know me. Years of using my resources and energy for purposes that aligned with my values. Years of being seen and appreciated for who I was rather than what I could provide. The phone calls came, that day dutiful birthday greetings from my children that felt perfunctory and strained. But they no longer had the power to hurt me the way they once had, because they were no longer my only source of validation or connection. I had built a life that didn't depend on their approval or attention. A life that was rich and meaningful, independent of their participation, Sarah asked. If I was happy with my choices, a question loaded with judgment and designed to make me second-guess myself. I told her I was happier than I'd been in years, which was true in ways she couldn't understand. Tommy wondered if I ever regretted throwing away the family money. And I told him I hadn't thrown it away. I had invested it in something that mattered to me, which was what Harold would have wanted. Michael, always the most thoughtful of my children, asked a different question. Do you miss us, Mom? The question caught me off guard with its simple honesty. I miss the people you used to be, I said, after thinking about it for a moment. I miss the children who were excited to see me, who told me about their days, who included me in their lives because they wanted my company rather than because they felt obligated to maintain contact. I miss feeling like I mattered to you as a person, not just as a mother or a grandmother or a future source of inheritance. There was a long pause before he said, quietly, "We could try to be those people again." You could, I agreed. But only if you want to, Michael. Only if you're interested in knowing who I actually am now, not just who I used to be to you. Not the same person I was when you were children, and I'm not the same person I was when your father died. I've grown and changed and discovered parts of myself I never knew existed. If you want a relationship with me, it has to be with the person I am now, not with some nostalgic version of the mother you remember. That conversation planted a seed that grew slowly over the following months. Michael started calling more regularly, not with duty calls, but with genuine curiosity about my life. He asked about my painting, my volunteer work, the foundation. He brought his children Banat for obligatory visits, but because he wanted them to know their grandmother as she actually was, not as a role she was expected to perform. The changes in Michael's approach to our relationship highlighted how transactional my connections with Tommy and Sarah had become. They continued their perfunctory check-ins, still hoping, I suspected, that I might change my mind about the foundation if they maintained just enough contact. But they showed no real interest in my life, my activities, my thoughts, or my feelings. They called because they felt they should, not because they wanted to hear my voice. The difference was stark and painful and ultimately liberating. I could see clearly now which relationships in my life were based on genuine affection and which were based on expectation or obligation. I could invest my emotional energy in people who valued it, rather than spreading it thin among people who took it for granted. 2 years after my forgotten 70th birthday, the Harold Peterson Foundation for Senior Dignity had helped over 300 elderly people maintain connections and independence. We had funded visiting programs in 4 different counties, subsidized transportation for medical appointments and social activities, and created emergency funds for seniors who needed help with utilities or groceries, but were too proud to ask their families for assistance. Every quarterly report felt like a birthday gift from Harold. A reminder that love continues even after death when it's channeled into meaningful action. The money he had saved to take care of me was taking care of hundreds of people like me, people who had been forgotten, overlooked, or managed rather than genuinely loved. My own life had become richer and more purposeful than it had been since the early years of my marriage, when Harold and I were building something together and everything felt possible. I had friends who looked forward to seeing me, activities that challenged and fulfilled me, responsibilities that mattered to people who needed what I could offer. I still lived in the house Harold and I had shared. But it felt different now, less like a museum of memories and more like a home for a life actively being lived. My paintings hung on the walls alongside photographs from my volunteer work and pictures of my book club friends. The good china came out regularly for dinner parties with people who appreciated both the food and the company. Whiskers and Luna had settled into comfortable old age alongside me. And I had added a third cat, a young tortoiseshell named Stella, who had been returned to the shelter twice for being too energetic. She brought life and chaos and joy into the house in ways that reminded me daily that it was never too late to add something new and challenging and wonderful to your life. On my 73rd birthday, I received a card from someone I didn't expectly Telena, my great-grandchild, who was now old enough to write her own name in wobbly letters. The card was clearly supervised by an adult, but the crayon drawing inside was all her own, a stick figure labeled Great Grandma. Standing next to what appeared to be a cat under a yellow sun, Sarah had enclosed a note explaining that Emma had asked about her great-grandmother after seeing old photos, and that she surrealized Emma barely knew me at all. I know things have been complicated between us, the note said, but Emma would like to meet you if you're interested. I was interested, but not on the terms they had become accustomed to. I didn't offer to drive to their house or rearrange my schedule around their convenience. Instead, I invited Emma to visit me on a Saturday afternoon, to see my paintings and meet my cats and help me make cookies the way children used to do before every activity became scheduled and supervised and optimized. Emma came with Sarah, seemed nervous and uncertain in ways that reminded me of how Michael had looked when he first visited after I'd started living my own life. She looked around my house as if seeing it for the first time, taking in the evidence of a full and active life that existed entirely independent of her knowledge or participation. "Mom," she said while Emma was in the garden chasing Stella and laughing with the pure joy of a 4-year-old who had discovered that cats sometimes act like puppies. "Your house feels different. Happy, somehow." "It is happy," I said, watching my great-grandchild through the window. "I'm happy." Took me a while to remember how. Emma stayed for 3 hours, and by the time she left, she had paint under her fingernails, flour in her hair, and a small watercolor painting of her own to take home. She hugged me goodbye with the unconscious affection of a child who had been genuinely enjoyed rather than merely tolerated. And she asked if she could come back next week. "If your mommy brings you," I said, "and if you call first to make sure." "I'm not busy." Sarah's eyebrows went up at that last part, the suggestion that I might be too busy for them, that my time had value and required respect rather than assumption. But she nodded and said they would call, and for the first time in years, I believed she meant it. That evening, as I cleaned up the evidence of our afternoon together, cookie crumbs and scattered art supplies and the beautiful chaos that children bring into carefully ordered adult lives, I thought about the woman I had been 3 years earlier, waiting in Harold's chair for a family that never came. That woman had been dying slowly, not from any disease, but from irrelevance, from the gradual erasure that comes when you make yourself so small and undemanding that people forget you exist. The woman I was now had been reborn through the simple, revolutionary act of mattering to herself. I had learned to value my own time, to pursue my own interests, to build relationships based on mutual enjoyment rather than biological obligation or financial expectation. I had discovered that real love's always a choice, never an inheritance, and that the people who choose to love you are infinitely more valuable than the people who love you only because they think they should. The foundation continued to grow, helping more people every year, creating connections and providing dignity to elderly people who had been written off by families that had moved on without them. Every success story felt personal. Every life touched felt like validation of the choice I had made to transform my hurt into purpose, my abandonment into action. My children's reactions to my new life settled into patterns that revealed who they truly were beneath the roles they had been playing. Tommy remained angry and resentful, unable to accept that I had agency independent of his expectations. Our relationship became cordial but distant, reduced to holiday cards and brief, strained phone calls that satisfied the minimum requirements of family connection without creating any real intimacy. Sarah slowly began trying to rebuild our relationship, bringing Emma for regular visits and gradually showing genuine interest in my activities and opinions. It was tentative progress, complicated by years of taking each other for granted, but it felt genuine in ways our previous interactions had not. She was learning to see me as a person rather than just a role, and I was learning to trust that. Her attention was motivated by affection rather than inheritance. Management. Michael continued to deepen his relationship with me, bringing his whole family for regular dinners and genuinely seeking my advice on parenting and marriage and life decisions. His children knew me as their grandmother who painted pictures and helped people and lived with 3 cats. Not as a distant figure who existed primarily to provide gifts on birthdays and Christmas, but the most important relationship I had rebuilt was with myself. I had learned to enjoy my own company, to pursue my own interests, to create meaning and purpose independent of other people's approval or attention. I had discovered that happiness doesn't come from being needed by others. It comes from needing yourself enough to invest in your own growth and fulfillment. On quiet evenings, I still sat in Harold's chair with my cats. But instead of waiting for the phone to ring or checking social media to see what I was missing, I read books chosen for my own pleasure, planned paintings I wanted to create, or simply enjoyed the peaceful satisfaction of a life well lived and actively chosen. The house still held memories of the family we had built together.
Tell me.
But it also held evidence of the woman I had become after learning to let go of who I thought I should be. Harold's presence was still there in the garden we had planted, and the values that guided the foundation, and the love that it taught me I was worthy of being chosen. But my presence was there too now, in ways it hadn't been for years, in the artwork on the walls and the life actively being lived and the future being created according to my own vision rather than other people's expectations. I was 73 years old, and for the first time since Harold died, I was looking forward to 74. The cats and I would celebrate together, along with the friends I had chosen and who had chosen me in return. There would be cake and candles and wishes for more years of mattering to people who saw me as I truly was. There would be laughter and conversation and the deep satisfaction of being present in my own life, rather than waiting on the margins of someone else's. And if my children remembered to call, that would be lovely. But if they forgot, I would still be fine. I had learned the most important lesson of my later years. The only person whose presence I could guarantee at my own birthday party was my own. And it turned out that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.